In January 2026, Lindsay Wagner sat beside Lee Majors at a convention in South Carolina, and a photograph of the two actors traveled across the internet with surprising emotional force. He was 87, she was months from turning 77, yet many viewers still saw Steve Austin and Jamie Summers reunited and smiling after half a century. The image revived an old question about what had truly existed between them. Wagner has now answered it, although not in the way romantic rumors expected. Lee Majors did change her life, but the real connection began before their famous chemistry with a younger sister, a reluctant actress, and one decision Lindsay nearly refused to make. Born in Los Angeles in 1949, Lindsay Wagner was 7 when her parents divorced, and the years that followed brought moves, family changes, and experiences she would later describe as domestic violence. She also struggled with dyslexia at a time when schools often treated learning differences as laziness or lack of ability. Lindsay could appear funny, expressive, and socially confident, yet she later acknowledged that humor sometimes became a way of avoiding emotions she did not know how to share. Acting entered her life not as a route to fame, but as a safer place to feel. When she was 12, family friend James Best, an actor and acting teacher, encouraged her to sit in on a class while she babysat for him. The adults around her recognized that the lively girl telling jokes was also protecting something. In class, she could explore grief, fear, and loneliness without having to admit that any of it belonged to her. The emotions were assigned to a character, which made them bearable. Years later, that habit of approaching performance from the inside would become the quality that separated Jamie Summers from the brightly colored action heroes around her. Lindsay did not immediately decide that Hollywood would be her life. She traveled, briefly attended college, and found formal study difficult because of dyslexia. She had considered psychology, and after leaving school, continued reading about behavior, healing, and human potential at her own pace. When she finally pursued acting professionally at 22, she was already less interested in celebrity than in what a story might reveal about people. Universal Studios signed her as a contract player, placing her in guest roles on Marcus Welby, M.D., The Rockford Files, and Owen Marshall, Counselor at Law. The system gave her steady work while reminding her that young actors rarely controlled what they were asked to become. Her performance in the 1973 film The Paper Chase suggested another future. As Susan Fields, the daughter of an intimidating Harvard law professor, Lindsay had material with emotional tension and adult ambiguity. Exactly the kind of work she hoped to pursue. She wanted drama, not a career built around gadgets and weakly villains. That distinction mattered when Universal presented her with one of the final assignments under her contract, a guest appearance on The $6 Million Man, the hugely popular series starring Lee Majors as astronaut Steve Austin. Lindsay's first instinct was to decline. The show was successful, but success was not the same as the path she had imagined for herself. She worried that science fiction adventure would move her farther from serious roles, and she had little reason to believe that a temporary girlfriend written into another star's series could alter anything. The person who changed her mind was not Lee Majors or a producer. It was her younger sister, Randy, 14 years younger and devoted to Lee's show. When Lindsay's mother learned that she was considering turning down the appearance, she objected immediately. Randy loved The $6 Million Man, and the idea that Lindsay could enter that world, meet Lee Majors, and then refuse seemed unthinkable. Lindsay later recalled her mother telling her, "You cannot not do that show. That is your sister's favorite show, period." She read the script again and accepted the role. Decades later, that small family conversation became the most revealing part of the rumor surrounding Lindsay and Lee, because his influence on her life was real before any scene had been filmed. A little girl's admiration for him pushed her older sister toward the character that would define her. Jamie Summers was introduced as Steve Austin's childhood sweetheart, a former professional tennis player whose history with him created an immediate tenderness. During a skydiving accident, Jamie suffered devastating injuries, and Steve pleaded for doctors to rebuild her with bionic implants similar to his own. The machinery gave the story its spectacle, but Lindsay and Lee gave it its emotional center. Steve was already television's nearly indestructible man, yet around Jamie he became vulnerable, frightened, and desperate. Lindsay played her with a warmth that made their shared past seem to exist beyond the pages of the script. Their connection on screen was persuasive because neither performer treated the relationship as decoration. Their scenes carried an ease that viewers often interpreted as evidence of something private, although no reliable public record has established that Lindsay and Lee had an off-screen affair. During the original Bionic years, Lee was married to Farrah Fawcett, while Lindsay's personal life followed a separate course. The rumors endured because audiences rarely separate convincing love stories from the people performing them. Steve and Jamie looked at one another with familiarity, and the series gave them a history filled with sacrifice. When Jamie's body began rejecting her bionic implants, Steve could save cities, but could not save the woman beside him. Her death was written as the tragic end of a guest character, and for Lindsay, it was expected to close one of her final obligations to Universal. Instead, the response from viewers transformed the ending into a beginning. Letters flooded the studio. Fans who had accepted impossible technology without complaint refused to accept Jamie's death. The network and producers recognized that Lindsay had created something larger than a temporary romantic interest, so the story was revised. Jamie had survived through an experimental procedure, although the trauma left her with memory loss. She could remember much of her life, but her love for Steve had disappeared, and attempts to recover it caused intense pain. The device allowed the character to return while also separating her from the man whose show had introduced her. That fictional separation carried a strange emotional truth. Lee Majors was the reason many people first met Lindsay Wagner, but Jamie Summers could not become fully hers while remaining only Steve Austin's girlfriend. The memory loss broke the romance and created space for another identity. When The Bionic Woman premiered on January 14, 1976, Lindsay was no longer visiting Lee's television universe. She was responsible for leading one of her own. The change was immediate and overwhelming. Within months, ordinary errands became difficult because strangers recognized her everywhere. Lindsay recalled shopping shortly before grocery stores closed, hoping the late hour would give her privacy. One evening, as she reached toward a shelf, she heard a woman say, "Lindsay, stop that!" For a moment, she thought the stranger was speaking to her, but the woman was correcting a small child. When the mother recognized Wagner, She explained that she loved the show so much she had named her daughter Lindsay. That encounter made the scale of Jamie's influence suddenly personal. Ratings were numbers. A child carrying her name was something else entirely. Fame also gave Lindsay leverage, and she used it to protect the part of Jamie that audiences could not hear through the electronic sound effects. She did not want to play what she later called a guy in a skirt, a woman whose only proof of strength was the ability to fight like a male action hero. She insisted on participating in story and character development, working closely with creator and producer Kenneth Johnson. They reviewed scripts scene by scene, and Lindsay challenged choices that did not feel honest to her experience as a woman. Her goal was not to remove action from the series, but to redefine what power looked like inside it. Jamie could lift heavy objects, run at extraordinary speed, and hear sounds beyond normal range. Yet Lindsay wanted her emotional sensitivity to remain equally important. She believed strength and compassion could exist in the same person, just as vulnerability did not cancel courage. Those ideas were quietly embedded in the way Jaime handled conflict, treated frightened people, and learned from her own mistakes. Lindsay later described the approach as subliminal teaching, because children arrived for adventure and absorbed a broader picture of what a powerful woman could be. That control changed the meaning of her relationship with Lee. The public continued to connect them as a pair, but professionally, Lindsay was no longer standing in his shadow. The character who had entered Steve Austin's life as a romantic tragedy became a cultural figure in her own right. In 1977, Lindsay won the Emmy for Outstanding Lead Actress in a Drama Series, an extraordinary recognition for a performance in science fiction. Behind that success, however, Lindsay's real body proved far more fragile than the one viewers watched each week. During the run of The Bionic Woman, she and actor Michael Brandon were involved in a serious automobile accident. Brandon suffered a severe eye injury, while Lindsay received facial injuries that left a small permanent scar above her upper lip. Production was disrupted while she recovered. On television, Jamie's broken body could be repaired through futuristic surgery, but Lindsay returned carrying a mark no script could erase. She married Brandon in 1976, but the marriage ended in 1979. Lindsay would marry 4 times in total and have 2 sons with stuntman Henry Kingi, whom she met through her work on The Bionic Woman. Those relationships belonged to her private life, not to the mythology viewers attached to Steve and Jamie. Each divorce made the fictional partnership appear cleaner from a distance. Television preserved Lee and Lindsay at their most beautiful, placed swelling music beneath their losses, and eventually offered the possibility that love, interrupted by tragedy, might wait forever. Real relationships rarely follow that kind of editing. Lee's life was equally separate from the fantasy. His marriage to Farrah Fawcett made them one of the era's most famous couples, and the pressures around their careers were public. Nothing in the verified record supports the idea that Lindsay secretly replaced Farrah or carried on a hidden romance with Lee during production. What Lindsay and Lee shared was less scandalous, but more durable. Professional trust, affection, and ownership of a fictional bond that millions of people refused to forget. When The Bionic Woman ended in 1978, Lindsay did not spend the following decades trying to recreate Jaime. She used the influence the series had given her to pursue projects about subjects television sponsors and networks had often avoided. Her films addressed family violence, capital punishment, illness, prejudice, and exploitation. The choices reflected questions she had carried since childhood, when acting became a place where difficult emotions could be expressed safely. The superhero role had not distracted her from serious work after all. It had given her enough power to make that work possible. She also moved more deeply into the study of holistic health and human potential. Having survived domestic violence when she was young, she later worked with programs connected to child abuse prevention and helped facilitate support for families dealing with domestic violence. The woman famous for mechanical strength became increasingly interested in how people recover from fear, shame, and learned patterns of harm. Jamie Summers could bend steel, but Lindsay's adult work returned repeatedly to a harder question. How does a person rebuild the parts no surgeon can replace? Lee Majors remained connected to that journey, although usually through the doorway of the characters they had created. In 1987, the two reunited for the return of the $6 Million Man and the Bionic Woman. They appeared together again in Bionic Showdown in 1989, and in 1994, the television movie Bionic Ever After finally allowed Steve Austin and Jamie Summers to marry. Nearly 20 years after Jaime first lost her memory of him, the fictional couple received the ending fans had wanted. For viewers, the wedding could feel like proof that the bond had always been destined to survive. For Lindsay and Lee, it was also a recognition of how permanently the roles had joined their public identities. They could spend years on separate projects and with separate families, but one photograph together would reopen the same emotional room. Fans were not simply remembering a television romance. They were remembering who they had been while watching it. That became especially clear in January 2026 at Central Carolina Comic-Con. Lindsay shared several images from the event, including the photograph beside Lee that prompted fans to respond with uncomplicated joy. The picture did not reveal a secret couple finally stepping into public view. It showed two longtime colleagues comfortable with the history between them, neither pretending that the characters were meaningless nor confusing them with reality. Around the 50th anniversary of the Bionic Woman, Lindsay began explaining that history with unusual clarity. She spoke about Randy's devotion to Lee's show, her own reluctance to accept the guest role, and the intervention from her mother that sent her back to the script. She also described the fan encounters that followed, and the adults who still told her Jamie had shaped their lives. One woman said the character helped inspire her to become an engineer at NASA. Others described difficult childhood homes in which Jaime offered an escape and the feeling that somebody dependable was on their side. Those stories changed the old rumor. The most important connection between Lindsay Wagner and Lee Majors was never a romance hidden from the public. It was a chain of influence that began with Lee's effect on a child he had never met, passed through Lindsay's hesitant decision, and reached millions of viewers through the woman she created. Lee was the recognizable face that drew her toward the opportunity, but Lindsay was the one who turned that opportunity into something no one had planned. At 77, she can now look back without reducing the relationship to either gossip or denial. Lee mattered enormously. Their chemistry mattered. His series provided the entrance. His performance gave her a strong emotional partner, and their reunions helped preserve a piece of television history. Yet the deeper confirmation is that Lindsay's life did not become significant because she stood beside Lee Majors. It became significant because once she entered his world, she insisted on bringing her own understanding of strength into it. The distinction is visible in the photograph from South Carolina. Lee sits beside the woman who was once introduced as Steve Austin's girlfriend, but the decades between them tell a different story. Lindsay survived the death written for her character, the limits executives placed around female heroes, the physical accident that interrupted production, marriages that did not last, and the burden of being remembered for one role. Rather than reject Jamie, she kept returning to the human meaning beneath the Bionics. The little sister who loved Lee Majors could never have known what she was setting in motion. Neither could Lindsay's mother, when she insisted that the role was too special to refuse. What looked like a small favor to Randy became a career, an Emmy, a cultural symbol, and a relationship with audiences that lasted 50 years. Lee remained the emotional hinge, but the door opened onto Lindsay Wagner's life. That is why the reunion image feels more moving than any invented confession. It contains affection without scandal, history without possession, and a shared past that never required a secret affair to matter. Steve and Jaime were allowed to become lovers, lose one another, and finally marry. Lindsay and Lee became something quieter. Two actors whose best work preserved a bond that belonged partly to them and partly to everyone who watched. In the end, the clearest answer was present in the photograph all along. Lindsay Wagner was not returning to the man who had secretly defined her private life. She was sitting beside the colleague whose television image once persuaded her to reconsider a script, and whose fictional love helped introduce the world to the woman she would become. 50 years later, the Bionic sound effects are gone. The cameras belong to fans, and the two familiar faces have aged naturally. What remains is the small, unlikely decision that connected them, and Lindsay's life on the other side of it.